Well, welcome to my 10th talk, though I'm slightly cheating. I'm going to split this talk into two, 10A and 10B. I have noticed that my previous two talks have gone beyond the sort of 15-minute limit I had given myself, and actually both turned out to be half an hour long. So, and I know the material here I have to cover will take half an hour. So 10A is really to do with the birth of the modern world. And in this, I'm not primarily going to be referring to the Bible. And I'm going to be looking primarily at the United Kingdom and the British Isles. Because that's the part of the world I know best. Also, there's a developments that take place in this particular nation that will have an impact on the rest of the world. And then in 10B, I want to look at the Reformation in particular, but also I want to use that as an opportunity to unpack what an historicist view of the book of Revelation would look like and how the Reformation fits into that. So, before I get on to look at British history from about 400 AD through to about 1600, I want to mention that there were also developments going on in the rest of the world with regard to the church. So we primarily concentrate on the church in the West and in Europe, whereas in fact there were two other major branches of the church. There was the Nestorian Church of Persia, modern-day Iran. Now this church had to keep itself separate from the Roman Church, because for quite a period of time, up to 600 AD, the Persians were at war with the Romans, or certainly not friendly towards them, and it would not have looked good if the Persian church, as it were, was too closely identified with the Romans. And so they developed their own sort of slightly distinctive theology, which is called Nestorianism. But I think we can put that to one side and rather concentrate on their missionary activity, which was phenomenal. They basically took the gospel to China, and there was a significant number of Christians in China right up until about the 1300s. Likewise, they took their gospel into Central Asia, sorts of places like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, places like that, and they would have been significant Christian communities there. The gospel also went to India. Now, there's a tradition in India that St. Thomas took the gospel first to the south western part of India, which is now known as Kerala State. And there you will find about a quarter of Kerala State are Christians. It's an incredible church there. And they date their origins to St. Thomas. We don't know necessarily too much about the actual details of that, but what we do know is the Nestorians certainly had a part to play in strengthening the Church of India, if not evangelizing in India as well. So you can see that quite literally, as far as Asia is concerned, the gospel reached out to a large portion of Asia long before European missionaries got there. Sadly, for reasons that are not altogether clear, the message started to wane. And I think the influence of one or two rather brutal times when Muslims destroyed the Christians in that part of the world under Tamerlan did not help. Okay. Now, in fairness, the Islamic authorities were not overly oppressive at times towards Christians, but just from time to time things flared up, and I think there was a particularly vicious time around about 14 to 1500 under Tamerlan when things were kind of wiped out. But having read some work on that, it did appear that the church was already waning at that point. The other church that came about was the Ethiopian church. And now we know about the eunuch that Philip converted, and he went back, and there was a long tradition of Jewish influence on Ethiopia. There's a tradition that goes back a long time to suggest that the Queen of Sheba was the Queen of Ethiopia. And these sort of histories are, I think, worth bearing in mind. And there certainly were the Flashers, who were rescued in the 1970s or 80s, I think, were a group of Ethiopian Jews that were returned back to Israel. So the long-established Jewish community in Ethiopia was a fertile ground for the gospel when it came. And our friend Athanasius, who I mentioned last time, he was, I believe, instrumental in setting up bishoprics in Ethiopia. And really up until the 20th century, the Ethiopian church, in a sense, saw itself as an offshoot of the Egyptian church, the Coptic church. But now it has its own separate hierarchy. Now, the Ethiopian church thrived and succeeded in evangelizing large areas around the part of Ethiopia that they were situated, but there was no evidence that they necessarily went beyond into the rest of Africa. So the church, however, is still there and still very strong and increasingly vibrant as well. Obviously, one mustn't forget the fact that in the Middle East there are many Christians that have in Syria and Iran, Iraq, of course the Egyptian Coptic Church, who've all survived 1,200 years of really being second-class citizens in their part of the world. Tragically, the Christian church in Turkey was all but wiped out in the last century due to genocide of the Armenians and a botched attempt by the Greeks to try and take over parts of Turkey, which led to the expulsion of many Greek Christians, so that I believe Turkey once had about 25% of its population as Christian. Now I don't think it even registers as a 1%. And obviously one has the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Eastern Orthodox Church obviously was associated with the Eastern Roman Empire, and that has survived, as I say, continuously, effectively from the time of Constantine. And you have out of that missionaries who went up to Russia and took the gospel there. Cyril was, I believe, one of the instrumental missionaries in that movement, and he created the Cyrillic alphabet, which the Russians use to this day. When we come to the West, with the destruction of the Western Roman Empire, the tribes that took over the Roman Empire were themselves already partially Christianized, though they were generally what we call Aryans. There was an attempt to reconvert these tribes. And I'm going to look particularly at the story of England, or British Isles, really, because I'm sure there are stories for each of the European nations that will be interesting. The one I know is the one for the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxons who invaded from about 450 onwards were not Christians. They were fully pagan, and they effectively whittled away the Roman society that existed, and the towns and the cities that existed just died off. There was no infrastructure to support them. The Anglo-Saxons were rural communities, and they didn't see any point in these towns as far as we can see. But because we don't have too much written evidence, we can't be certain of that. And that's where you get the great story of King Arthur, who may or may not exist in reality. But if he does exist, he would have been a Romano-British general stroke king who would have tried to hold back the Saxons, no doubt. The Saxons never really took over Wales, and therefore Christianity was maintained in Wales throughout this time. And St. David is the famous patron saint of Wales, but he's a real character. And there are lots of stories of Welsh Celtic saints throughout this period. But the Welsh could have kept the history of the British Isles. However, as I've mentioned before, history gets easily destroyed by conquering people. And I'm not absolutely sure what happened, but it appears that around about 800 or 900 AD, the English destroyed the Welsh histories and the Welsh priests. And sadly, much of what could have been known about particularly Celtic history prior to the Roman conquest was lost. Geoffrey of Monmouth claims to have had access to this history, and he wrote an account of it, and people like King Cole and Brutus and various other folks, some of which Shakespeare uses for his plays, were standard fare in Tudor England as a history of pre-Roman England, pre-Roman Britain. However, latterly, people have dismissed Geoffrey of Monmouth's history as being fables, and so we now effectively have no real history of Celtic Britain other than what they might have lived like, rather than any vision of their kings and so forth. So you can look at Geoffrey of Monmouth if you wish, just kind of warning you that many people dismiss him. But it may be that he did have access to these Welsh records. It's so difficult to know this far ahead, as it were, 800 years after he wrote his works. What we do know, and I'm pretty certain of, is that around about the end of the 4th century AD, a young man called Patrick was captured by pirates from Ireland, and he was a Romano-British Christian, but he was a young man, probably in his teenage years, and he was effectively a slave in Ireland looking after sheep for a number of years until he escaped. But God spoke to Patrick to tell him to go back to the Irish and bring the gospel to them. And he did, and amazingly, the Irish turned to God. And it's extraordinary, some of these saints of this time who just went out with no military power, no backup whatsoever. And often they chopped down the local religious trees that were supposed to be sacred. You know, this was not the cross-cultural mission work that you tend to encourage today, but it was seemingly very effective in those days. And because Patrick basically said, well, if your God's real, he's going to punish me. If he's not real, he's not a real God. And the Irish bought it. And so the Irish really did become very strongly Christian. And that's really important because when education and learning was being lost across a lot of Europe, it was retained in Ireland. And Ireland, though it was never a Roman colony, became a centre of learning. And from Ireland came Columba, who around about 590, I think, landed on the island of Iona in the west coast of Scotland. Beautiful little island, I've been there. And he established a mission there and effectively started to evangelize the Scottish. And the Scottish turned to Christ, and he was very effective. And then from Iona was sent down to northern Britain another person called Aidan. I like Aidan. He's just a believer, very, very wonderful person who everyone really adored. Totally defenseless. The king kept on giving him horses to help him get around the Northumbrian countryside, and as soon as Aidan found somebody who was impoverished or needed a horse, he just gave it away. So Aidan set up a mission in Holy Island, Lindisfarne, and that's off the coast of Northumberland, and started to evangelize the north of England. Around about the same time, St. Augustine landed in the south coast, and he came from the Roman Church, and he started evangelizing the south of England. And around about 660, at the Synod of Whitby, the abbess there got the two factions together with the kings, and they agreed what was going to be the standard religious practice for the Britain. And so to some extent, Celtic Christianity then had to be subordinate to Roman Christianity. And there was quite a renaissance at this point in English history because, you know, learning was beginning to flourish. These monasteries were established all over the country, and there were centres of excellence. Sadly, this story is about to come crashing to the ground because the Vikings arrived around about the end of the 8th century. I think it was 793. They plundered the monastery at Lindisfarne. And over the next 80, 90 years, most of the British Isles were plundered and effectively destroyed, and whatever government structures existed were undermined and destroyed. And the left was only one independent kingdom out of the 7, the heptarchy, that used to exist. And that was the Kingdom of Wessex. And this is where I think one of my great characters of English history appears, Alfred, called Alfred the Great, the only king that has that designation in English history. And Alfred the Great defeated the Vikings. He was around about 870 to 900 AD. And he wasn't a very strong man in many ways. He actually possibly suffered from some sort of ulcers, maybe irritable bowel syndrome, because he is forever complaining of problems down that part of the world in his body. But he's also a very committed Christian, and he treats the Viking opposition with great magnanimity and seeks peace with them. And they basically divide England in two, with the east coast going to east and north going to the Danes, as it were. It's called Danelaw, and the south and the west going to Alfred and the Wessex people. And the line really was marked from London right up to Chester. That was sort of division line. Now, Alfred the Great wasn't just a successful warrior, but he was a very far-sighted king. He re-established education. He even translated some of the books of the Bible into English, and had translations done as well of some of the important books of learning. And so that he encouraged scholars to come over. He built up the navy. He thought, well, the only way to defeat the Vikings is to make sure I've got a bigger navy than they have. He created fortified towns all across the south of England, burghs, which still exist to this day, which were well planned and designed so that there were defensive points to stop the Vikings from taking over. I think Alfred left a legacy of a king as a servant of his people. He wasn't ostentatious. He didn't build particularly for himself, but he definitely wanted everyone he was surrounded by to learn how to read and write. He insisted that his nobles and his soldiers, senior soldiers, did that. And I think that legacy, and the fortunate fact he had about 4 very successful generations after him, meant that by the time England was to go through another rocky patch of Danes attacking and then being taken over by William the Conqueror, the Normans, there was established a principle of good government. And good government is very important because it provides stability, it provides people invest in the land and invest in the future if they know there's secure government. Now, when the Normans took over in 1066, William the Conqueror replaced literally all the landowners, and it was one of the biggest transfers of land ownership probably the world's ever known. Over 90% of the land got transferred from Saxon hands into Norman hands. However, William did preserve the governmental structures of Alfred. And that meant that when he came around to doing the Domesday Book in 1087, I think it was, this was the most amazing medieval book. This detailed in meticulous detail all the land ownership in England. And it showed just how well governed England could become. And the principles of the shires and the hundreds and the jurisdiction that was going on. And Henry I and Henry II both solidified a very strong sense of law to be established by the king's justices. And this is important because what's happening here is a concept of a nation being born with a clear central hierarchy where justice is administered not by the local nobles or feudal lords, but by the king. Now, this becomes a bit of a crisis in 1215 when there's a bad king on the throne, or let's say a king that the nobles do not like. Now, John had the misfortune of losing wars, which is never a very good thing to do, against the French particularly, and he was also rather authoritarian and would just simply do things on the spur of the moment, and it was quite brutal. The barons insisted that John would submit to the Magna Carta, in which a principle was established that was going to be very important. The king was under the law. The king wasn't the law. And a principle was beginning to be established over the next 100 years, with the reissuing of the Magna Carta and the establishment under Simon de Montfort of the First Parliament. And that Parliament was then actually, as it were, recommissioned under Edward I, that there was to be consultation over taxation, that Parliament was to pass the laws that were going to affect the whole country, and that the king was under Parliament. Not under Parliament, you shouldn't say that. The king was under the law. Now, this is a very important step forward in terms of democracy. Now, do not for one moment think that Parliament was democratic the way that we understand it. But hitherto, kings had begun to be quasi-religious figures who seemed to have complete control of law. And when many European nations went towards an absolute monarchy in the 16th and 17th century, such was not the case in England because of this developing parliamentary tradition. And I actually think there's a couple of further reasons why this happened. One of them is, funnily enough, the work of Thomas Cromwell in the Reformation. Thomas Cromwell is been quite famous because of Hilary Mantel's books that she's written on him, Wolf Hall, etc. And he's well worth thinking about because he's 1530 to 1540 as effectively co-ruler of Henry VIII of England. But he establishes a very strong sense of good government done by professionals and by the gentry rather than nobility. And he is secretly and very obviously laying down a reformation via the back door. Now, Henry VIII is not interested in Protestantism. And you have got Martin Luther with his Reformation in Germany. But Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Cromwell, who's effectively the Prime Minister, no, it's not the right term, but he's effectively running the country on behalf of Henry, are working together to dissolve the monasteries, get Bibles into churches, and to try and establish a framework for what we might call Protestant Christianity within England. And that's going to flower very quickly under Edward VI. Then it gets turned back under his sister Mary for about 6 years, when you have a number of Protestants who are burnt and die for their faith, including Cranmer. But then Elizabeth I, who is the final child of to ascend the throne from Henry VIII, establishes permanently the Protestant settlement. The development of democracy in this country continues really with the Civil War, which takes place in the following century, because James I and Charles I both feel that there should be might say an absolute monarchy like going on in Europe. They like what they see in Europe. They're kind of fed the idea that they're chosen by God, therefore they talk about the divine right of kings. And they see parliaments as being factious things that cause disunity. As I mentioned before, people who govern like to have unity. Well, Parliament has been used to being treated with some degree of respect by Henry VIII and by Elizabeth. And so when James and Charles fail to show them the respect that they feel they're due, Parliament is not going to roll over. And this eventually leads to a civil war where quite literally the king, in this case Charles I, storms out of London because he knows he has no popularity there and decides to raise an army to fight Parliament. And the rest, as they say, is history. He lost and eventually lost his head. However, it would be fair to say that this was not a popular decision that the king should be executed, because the English were profoundly religious. And they did, to some extent, feel the king was God's chosen. And so it wasn't going to be the case that this civil war was going to lead to a permanent republic. So in 1660, after Oliver Cromwell had died, there was a restoration of the monarchy. There was still some unfinished business, because if the monarch was Roman Catholic and the nation was Protestant, then there would be issues of division that would be impossible to resolve. And so when James II came to the throne, who was a Roman Catholic, those tensions came to a head, and within a few years he was forcibly evicted, and we took on board a new king who was married to Mary, who was of the line of Charles I. And this is William III, and who was a Dutch king, William of Orange, and he became King of England. And that's called the Glorious Revolution, and that was established the structure that we still have to this day in this country, which is of a constitutional monarchy that is going to be a member of the Church of England. And this is probably that final the final defeat, as it were, of an old system of government that existed in the medieval period, and establishment of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And that is what we have to this day. And obviously the 19th century saw the development of ever wider rights to voting, and that was completed in 1918 with the giving the vote to women. And that really is a summation of the development of democracy within the United Kingdom. And to some extent, that development influenced the world, because the American development of democracy with their revolution in 1776 fed off the concept of parliamentary democracy. They obviously developed their own form, their own constitution, which was a republic. And to some extent, the French Revolution would have been feeding off the concepts of democracy they saw across the water. But again, they developed their own concept of democracy based on a different principle to the British one. And it was on their principles that their democracy was developed. And so really you've got three sources of democracy going on in the 19th and 20th century. You have the British, the American, and the continental, based on the French. But democracy has become widely accepted as the means for government in our modern world. Now, my next talk will be looking at the Reformation and looking at the book of Revelation in that talk. Thank you for listening.